The conference room on Station Omega-7 buzzed with the kind of self-satisfied energy that only came from beings who thought they had everything figured out. Which, as it turned out, they absolutely did not. Admiral Vashti adjusted her ceremonial robes, the deep purple fabric shimmering under the artificial lights as she gazed around the polished table. Her 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of contentment among the Zenthari. To her left sat Commander Tom Mali, his crystalline exoskeleton reflecting rainbows across the walls, while Judge Quintera's trunk-like appendages drummed rhythmically against her chair. Fellow council members, Admiral Vashti began, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that suggested she had never been wrong about anything in her life. Oh, how wrong she was about to be. Today marks a historic moment. We are on the verge of welcoming our newest species into the peaceful herbivore alliance. Commander Tom Mali's head tilted, creating a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The humans, correct? Such a delightful species. So gentle, so leafy in their preferences. Judge Quintera's massive frame shifted forward, her 3 mouths speaking in harmony. Indeed. Their diplomatic team was most refreshing during our initial meetings. Not once did they express any violent tendencies or disturbing dietary habits. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife, which, coincidentally, humans were quite fond of doing. Admiral Vashti pulled up the holographic display, showing images from the previous week's diplomatic dinner. There, in glorious 3-dimensional detail, were the human representatives politely nibbling on fermented moss cakes and sipping algae smoothies. Their smiles looked only slightly strained, though the aliens had interpreted this as sophisticated appreciation for fine cuisine. "Look at them," Admiral Vashti said, gesturing proudly at the projection. Such refined palates. The way they savored our prize-winning kelp salad was truly moving. I believe Ambassador Amy even asked for the recipe. What Amy had actually asked was whether there was a bathroom nearby, but translation errors were common in interspecies diplomacy. Commander Tom Mali's segments clicked together in what passed for laughter among his people. Remember how excited they became when we mentioned our 17-course vegetable tasting menu? Their eyes positively lit up. Those weren't excitement lights in their eyes. Those were the desperate gleams of beings calculating exactly how many protein bars they had stashed in their quarters. "The preliminary reports are unanimous," Judge Quintera announced, shuffling through her data tablets with practiced efficiency. "Humans exhibit all the classic markers of evolved herbivores. Small canine teeth, primarily plant-based agriculture in their historical records, and most importantly, their complete lack of predatory behavior during our interactions. The fact that humans had been on their absolute best diplomatic behavior, carefully trained to avoid any mention of their rather extensive history of being apex predators, seemed to have escaped everyone's notice entirely." Admiral Vashti stood, her robes billowing dramatically. She did love a good dramatic billow. "Based on our thorough analysis of exactly 3 meals and 2 cultural exchange presentations, I am confident in declaring that humans are, without question, a peaceful herbivorous species perfectly suited for membership in our alliance." The hologram shifted to show the proposed integration timeline, complete with color-coded charts and optimistic projections. Phase 1 involved cultural exchange programs. Phase 2 included shared agricultural initiatives. These 3 promised joint colonization efforts of garden worlds across the sector. Their commitment to plant-based nutrition aligns perfectly with our core values, Commander Tom Mali added, his voice resonating with conviction. "Finally, a species that understands that violence has no place in civilized society." Judge Quintera's appendages waved in agreement. Their diplomatic team specifically mentioned their love of salads and fresh vegetables. Such wholesome preferences, such peaceful inclinations. What the humans had actually said was that they enjoyed salads as part of a balanced diet, but selective hearing was apparently not limited to organic species. The meeting continued with enthusiastic planning for welcome ceremonies, shared botanical gardens, and peaceful coexistence initiatives. Charts were presented showing projected harmony levels. Timelines were established for cultural integration protocols. Everyone was very pleased with themselves. Not one of them thought to ask what humans actually ate when they weren't trying to make a good first impression. Not one of them wondered why the human ship's waste disposal systems seemed unusually robust for a species that supposedly only consumed plants. And certainly none of them questioned why the humans had politely declined the offer to tour the station's prized meditation gardens, claiming they were still adjusting to the lighting. The meeting concluded with handshakes, ceremonial exchanges of potted plants, and mutual congratulations on their enlightened approach to interspecies diplomacy. Tomorrow, they would learn exactly how enlightened they actually were. The universe, as it turned out, had quite a sense of humor about these things. Amy Kowalski stepped off the transport shuttle with the kind of practiced diplomatic smile that had gotten her through 7 years of interspecies relations. Behind her, Brandon Torres adjusted his formal jacket and tried not to wince at the overwhelming smell of fermented plant matter that seemed to permeate everything on Station Omega-7. "Welcome, welcome." Admiral Vashi practically bounced forward, her forearms extended in what humans had learned was the Zenthari equivalent of a bear hug. "We are absolutely thrilled to have you here for our official integration ceremonies." Amy accepted the greeting gracefully, though she made a mental note to check her ribs later. "The pleasure is entirely ours, Admiral. We're honored by your hospitality." Brandon nodded politely, his eyes already scanning the elaborate banquet setup that dominated the docking bay. Tables groaned under the weight of what appeared to be every conceivable variety of plant life in the known galaxy, arranged in patterns that probably meant something culturally significant, but looked remarkably like someone had exploded a greenhouse. "We have prepared a feast in your honor," Commander Tom Mali announced, his crystalline structure chiming with excitement. "Our finest chefs have worked for days to create the perfect herbivorous dining experience." The humans exchanged a glance that lasted approximately 0.3 seconds but conveyed volumes about their current situation. Amy's smile never wavered. "How thoughtful," she said, her diplomatic training kicking in with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. "We're always eager to experience local cuisine." Judge Quintara's trunk-like appendages gestured grandly toward the feast. "We researched your earth vegetables extensively. Notice how we've incorporated familiar elements like," she consulted her notes frantically, "leaf-based nutrition discs and chlorophyll enhancement tubes." Brandon blinked. "You mean lettuce and celery?" "Yes, exactly." Judge Quintara beamed with 3 mouths simultaneously. "We are such careful listeners to cultural preferences." The spread was, admittedly, impressive in its scope if not its appeal. Towers of what looked like seaweed rose from crystal platters. Bowls of something that might charitably be called salad occupied every available surface, though the resemblance to anything humans would recognize as food was purely coincidental. "And here," Admiral Vashi announced proudly, "is our piece de resistance. Fermented moss paste, aged for 30 cycles in underground caves. A delicacy among all civilized species." Amy stared at the gray, bubbling substance that seemed to be moving on its own. "It looks lively." "Oh yes, the fermentation process creates beneficial bacterial colonies, completely safe for herbivorous digestive systems," Commander Tom Mali explained helpfully. "We made sure to avoid anything that might upset your gentle plant processing stomachs." Brandon's stomach chose that exact moment to rumble audibly, though not from anticipation. The sound echoed through the docking bay like a small earthquake. "Ah, hunger calls," Judge Quintara exclaimed, clapping her appendages together. "Please sit, sit, sit. We have arranged the seating according to your species' documented preference for communal plant consumption." The humans were ushered to what appeared to be oversized high chairs, clearly designed for beings who spent their time grazing rather than sitting upright. Amy managed to fold herself into the contraption with only minimal dignity loss, while Brandon required assistance from 2 helpful helix attendants. "We studied your feeding behaviors extensively," Admiral Vashi explained, ladling generous portions of various green substances onto their plates. "Notice how we've provided multiple small portions, perfect for your species' documented preference for continuous grazing throughout the day." Amy stared at her plate, which now resembled a science experiment gone wrong. "You're very thorough in your research." "We pride ourselves on cultural sensitivity," Commander Tom Molly said, settling into his own feeding station with obvious satisfaction. "We even adjusted the lighting to simulate your home world's agricultural zones." The lighting was indeed adjusted. It was the sickly yellow-green that suggested either a dying sun or a very enthusiastic algae bloom. Brandon picked up what he hoped was a utensil and poked experimentally at something purple and squishy. It poked back. It poked back. "This is quite an experience," he managed. "We knew you would appreciate the authenticity," Judge Quintara said proudly. "Tomorrow we have even more exciting botanical adventures planned." Amy smiled and took a careful bite of something that tasted like seawater mixed with disappointment, while Brandon wondered if diplomatic immunity covered requests for pizza delivery. Day 2 of what Amy had privately begun calling the great vegetable torture dawned with the kind of artificial brightness that made everyone look slightly green around the gills. Which, given the company, was probably appropriate. Moran, a junior diplomat from the Helix delegation, practically vibrated with excitement as he approached the human quarters. His crystalline segments chimed like an overenthusiastic wind chime in a hurricane. "Ambassador Amy, cultural attaché Brandon," he announced, his voice pitched high with barely contained enthusiasm, "I have arranged something very special for today." Amy looked up from her breakfast of what appeared to be grass clippings suspended in purple liquid. Her smile had developed a slight twitch that she hoped passed for diplomatic interest, rather than impending nervous breakdown. "How wonderful, Moran. What did you have in mind?" Moran's segments shifted in what passed for a conspiratorial lean among his people. "I have secured reservations at the most exclusive herbivore restaurant in this entire sector, the Green Garden of Eternal Satisfaction." Brandon paused mid-sip of his morning beverage, which tasted like liquid sadness with hints of chlorophyll. "That sounds comprehensive." "Oh, it is," Moran gushed, his excitement reaching levels that suggested he might actually combust from joy. "They serve 47 different varieties of processed plant matter, each prepared according to ancient traditions of peaceful consumption. The waiting list is normally 3 cycles long." Amy and Brandon exchanged another one of those lightning-fast glances that had become their primary form of communication since arriving at the station. This one roughly translated to "How much longer can we keep this up before we start gnawing on the furniture?" "We would be honored," Amy said, because diplomatic training was apparently stronger than self-preservation instincts. 3 hours later, they found themselves seated at a table made entirely of compressed algae, surrounded by the gentle sounds of satisfied herbivores munching their way through what could charitably be described as food. The Green Garden of Eternal Satisfaction was exactly as advertised, assuming one's definition of satisfaction involved consuming things that looked like they belonged in a biology textbook rather than on a plate. "Now," Moran announced, consulting a menu that appeared to be printed on actual leaves, "what would you prefer to start with? The fermented kelp ribbons are particularly celebrated today." Brandon stared at the menu, his diplomatic composure finally beginning to show cracks. 24 hours of eating nothing but various forms of plant matter had left him in a state that could best be described as desperately polite. "Moran," he said carefully, his voice carrying just the slightest edge of strain, "do you perhaps have any protein options?" The restaurant fell silent. Every herbivore in the establishment turned to stare at their table. Moran's crystalline structure stopped chiming entirely, creating a sudden and deeply uncomfortable quiet. "Protein?" Moran repeated, his voice uncertain. I do not understand this word in this context." Amy leaned forward, sensing that they had crossed some sort of cultural line but not entirely sure how. "Brandon means, are there any dishes that might contain more substantial nutrition? Like a nice steak?" Brandon added helpfully, apparently deciding that subtlety was no longer serving their cause. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or catastrophe. In this case, it was definitely heading toward the latter. Moran's segments began to vibrate in what Amy was beginning to recognize as deep confusion. "Steak?" he repeated slowly, as if the word might make more sense if he pronounced it differently. Is this some form of earth vegetable we have not encountered? Brandon opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again like a fish gasping for air. Well, technically. Oh, how fascinating, Moran exclaimed, his excitement returning with renewed force. A plant we have not catalogued. Is it perhaps a root vegetable? A flowering shrub? Some form of nutritious moss? Amy realized they had reached a critical juncture. She could either continue the charade and potentially find herself eating moss for the rest of the diplomatic mission, or she could attempt to explain the concept of meat to beings who had apparently never encountered it. Moran, she said gently, a steak is not exactly a plant. Not a plant? Moran's confusion was now visible in the rapid shifting of his crystalline segments. Then what manner of vegetation is it? Perhaps some form of mineral-enriched algae? Brandon looked around the restaurant, noting that every single patron was now listening with rapt attention. Several had stopped eating entirely, their various appendages frozen mid-chew. He began, then stopped. How exactly did one explain the concept of meat to a species that had apparently evolved without any knowledge of carnivores? It comes from animals, Amy said finally, deciding that directness was their only remaining option. The word animals hit the restaurant like a sonic boom. Somewhere in the back, a server dropped what might have been a tray of fermented seaweed. The gentle background music of satisfied munching stopped entirely. Moran's crystalline structure had gone completely still, which Amy was beginning to realize was the helix equivalent of a system crash. Animals? He whispered, as if the word might summon something terrible if spoken too loudly. You know, Brandon said, apparently committed to this course of action now, cows, pigs, chickens. We eat them? The collective gasp that rose from the assembled herbivores could probably be heard 3 decks away. Within minutes of the great steak revelation, word had spread through the station's communication networks with the efficiency of a particularly aggressive computer virus. The Green Garden of Eternal Satisfaction had become ground zero for what would later be remembered as the most awkward first contact incident in recorded galactic history. Morden, the station's head chef and a being who took his culinary responsibilities with the seriousness of a religious calling, he materialized at their table with the speed of someone whose entire worldview had just been challenged. Did I hear correctly? Morden demanded, his 6 arms gesticulating wildly while his main mouth spoke and his secondary mouth translated for any species that might have missed the urgency. You mentioned a plant called steak that we do not have in our botanical databases. Amy looked at Brandon, who looked back at Amy, both of them realizing simultaneously that they had somehow managed to dig themselves into a hole so deep that they could probably see the station's foundation from where they sat. Morden, Amy began carefully, I think there might be some confusion about what exactly a steak is. Nonsense, Morden declared with the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about food in his entire life. I am the finest herbivorous chef in 7 sectors. If there is a plant that can provide superior nutrition for our honored human guests, I will find it and prepare it with the reverence it deserves. He pulled out what appeared to be a tablet made of compressed bark and began typing furiously with 4 of his 6 hands. Steak, 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 he muttered. Perhaps it is a regional variant of the earth plant known as lettuce, or possibly a subspecies of their celebrated kale. Brandon made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Morden, you're not going to find it in any plant database. Preposterous, Morden snorted, his secondary mouth adding a dismissive trill. Every edible plant in the known galaxy is catalogued. I have personally contributed to 17 botanical surveys. There is no plant that escapes my knowledge. It was Moran who finally asked the question that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. If it is not in the plant databases, he said slowly, his crystalline segments dimming with growing dread, then what exactly is this steak substance? Amy took a deep breath, the kind that people take before jumping off cliffs or delivering news that will fundamentally alter someone's understanding of reality. A steak, she said clearly, is a piece of meat cut from a cow. The silence that followed was so complete that you could probably hear a pin drop 3 solar systems away. Meat, Morden repeated, his 6 arms frozen in mid-gesture. Turned from a cow. Yes, Brandon confirmed, apparently deciding that they were past the point of diplomatic euphemisms. Cows are large mammals. We raise them, and then we eat them. Morden's tablet fell from his suddenly nerveless grasp, clattering against the algae table with a sound like breaking dreams. You eat living creatures? Moran whispered, his voice barely audible above the station's air recycling systems. Well, not while they're still living, Amy clarified, though this distinction seemed to provide no comfort whatsoever to their audience. That was the moment when Quartermaster burst through the restaurant's entrance with the kind of urgency usually reserved for hull breaches or reactor malfunctions. His species communicated primarily through rapid color changes, and right now he was cycling through what appeared to be the entire visible spectrum with the speed of a malfunctioning traffic light. Emergency protocols, he announced, his universal translator struggling to keep up with his rapid-fire panic. We need immediate security assessment. The humans are they are. Carnivores, Morden finished, the word dropping like a stone into still water. Quartermaster A's color cycling stopped entirely, settling on a shade of pale gray that probably meant something like existential dread in his species' emotional vocabulary. Apex predators, Brandon corrected helpfully, apparently deciding that if they were going to terrify the local population, they might as well be accurate about it. Technically speaking, humans evolved as persistence hunters. We used to chase our prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Several patrons in the restaurant made sounds that their universal translators tactfully declined to process. You chase things? Moran's voice had risen to a pitch that was probably only audible to certain species of space dolphins. Used to, Amy emphasized, shooting Brandon a look that suggested he might want to dial back the nature documentary commentary. Nowadays we mostly just go to grocery stores. This explanation did not seem to provide the reassurance she had hoped for. Grocery stores, Quartermaster repeated, his color shifting to what might charitably be called nauseous yellow. Are these hunting grounds? Killing fields? They're buildings where we buy food that other people have prepared, Brandon explained. Very civilized, really. Usually there's mood lighting. Morden had begun rocking back and forth, muttering under his breath in what sounded like a complex mathematical equation involving nutritional values and moral philosophy. All this time, he said finally, we have been feeding predators nothing but plants. We have been starving apex carnivores. We're omnivores, actually, Amy corrected gently. We eat both plants and meat. We've been perfectly fine with your vegetables. Mostly. But her clarification was lost in the growing wave of panic that was spreading through the restaurant like ripples in a pond. Patrons were standing up, knocking over chairs, and making rapid exits while communicating in urgent whistles, clicks, and color changes. Quartermaster was now speaking rapidly into his communication device, his words tumbling over each other in their haste. Security alert level orange. We have 2 confirmed carnivorous life forms in the civilian dining area. Repeat, carnivorous death machines are currently mobile in Section 7. We're not death machines, Brandon protested, but his objection was drowned out by the sound of emergency alerts beginning to echo through the station's communication systems. Moran had apparently achieved some kind of philosophical breakthrough because his crystalline structure was now glowing with what appeared to be religious fervor. This explains everything, he announced to no one in particular. The way they smiled when we offered them vegetation, with the polite expressions of gratitude. They were humoring us. They were being merciful to their prey. Amy opened her mouth to correct this interpretation, then closed it again as she realized that any attempt to explain the concept of diplomatic courtesy was probably doomed to failure at this point. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of blast doors sealing. The sound of blast doors sealing was quickly followed by the considerably more alarming sound of combat boots marching in formation, which was then overshadowed by the absolutely terrifying sound of General Kraftnog's voice echoing through the station's communication system. All units, Code Orange is now in effect. His gravelly voice announced with the kind of authority that suggested he had been waiting his entire military career for an excuse to use emergency protocols. We have 2 hostile carnivorous entities loose on Station Omega-7. Implement containment procedures immediately. Amy looked at Brandon, who was still holding a forkful of what might have been fermented algae. Did he just call us hostile entities? I think he did, Brandon replied, setting down his fork with the careful precision of someone who was beginning to realize that lunch had taken a very serious turn. Should we be flattered or offended? Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of what appeared to be half the station's security force, all armed with weapons that hummed ominously and all pointed directly at the table, where 2 humans sat surrounded by the remains of what had been a perfectly peaceful herbivore meal. General Krafnog himself materialized at the head of the security formation, his massive frame blocking most of the restaurant's artificial sunlight. His species apparently evolved from something that looked like a cross between a rhinoceros and a filing cabinet. And right now he was radiating the kind of barely controlled aggression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. Step away from the civilians, he commanded, his weapon trained on Amy with the steady precision of someone who took his job very seriously indeed. Amy raised her hands slowly, the universal gesture for please don't shoot the diplomat. General Krafnog, I think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here. No misunderstanding, General Krafnog growled, his secondary mouth adding what sounded like very unflattering commentary about apex predators and their dietary habits. We know what you are now. We know what you do to innocent creatures. Brandon, meanwhile, had noticed that the restaurant's other patrons were rapidly constructing what appeared to be improvised fortifications out of tables, chairs, and decorative plants. Several were speaking urgently into communication devices while eyeing the humans with the kind of expression usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. Is that gentleman building a bunker out of salad plates? Brandon asked conversationally. I think he is, Amy replied, watching as a Helix delegate carefully arranged a barrier of fermented kelp containers. Should we tell him that we're really not planning to eat anyone? At this point, I'm not sure they'd believe us. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Drohorn, whose entrance was accompanied by the kind of dramatic music that suggested someone had been waiting for an excuse to use the emergency soundtrack. His tentacles writhed with what Amy was beginning to recognize as the galactic equivalent of extreme agitation. Report, Admiral Drohorn demanded, his multiple eyes focusing on General Krafnog with laser-like intensity. 2 confirmed apex predators discovered in civilian dining area, General Krafnog replied with military precision. Subjects were observed discussing consumption of living creatures in casual conversation. Recommend immediate containment and transportation to secure facility. Amy blinked. We were talking about ordering lunch. Lunch, Admiral Drohorn repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to be more threatening than shouting. You call the consumption of innocent creatures lunch. Well, when you put it like that, it does sound a bit harsh, Brandon admitted. But in our defense, the cows are already dead by the time we eat them. It's not like we're chasing them around the restaurant. This clarification did not appear to provide the comfort he had intended. By now, the improvised fortifications had grown into what appeared to be a small fortress constructed entirely of restaurant furniture and decorative vegetation. Several species were engaged in what looked like heated tactical discussions about optimal defensive positions against carnivorous assault. This is fascinating, Amy observed, watching as a group of Zenthari engineers began calculating structural integrity for their lettuce-based barricade. They've managed to turn a dining room into a military installation in under 10 minutes. Very efficient, Brandon agreed. Though I'm not sure how effective a wall made of seaweed is going to be against determined humans. Should we tell them we weren't actually planning to attack anyone? I tried that. They seemed to think it was some kind of predatory deception technique. Admiral Drohorn was now speaking rapidly into his command communicator, issuing orders that involved words like quarantine, behavioral analysis, and emergency evacuation protocols. Meanwhile, General Krafnog had positioned his security forces in what appeared to be a standard anti-carnivore formation. Though Amy suspected this was the first time anyone had actually needed to use such a thing. "Attention all station personnel," Admiral Drohorn's voice echoed through the communication system. "Code Orange remains in effect. All civilians are advised to remain in secure locations until the carnivorous threat can be properly contained." "Carnivorous threat," Brandon repeated thoughtfully. "I've been called worse things, I suppose." "Have you really?" "Well, no, not really. But I'm trying to look on the bright side here." The bright side became considerably dimmer when additional security forces began arriving from what appeared to be every corner of the station. The restaurant was now completely surrounded by beings with very large weapons and very small amounts of patience. Moran, who had somehow managed to achieve an even higher state of panic than when the conversation started, he was now broadcasting live updates to what appeared to be the entire galactic communication network. "This is unprecedented," he announced breathlessly to his audience. "We are witnessing the first documented case of apex predators infiltrating a peaceful herbivore alliance. The implications for galactic security are staggering." Amy turned to Brandon with the kind of expression usually reserved for moments when diplomatic careers were about to end in spectacular fashion. "You know," she said conversationally, "I'm starting to think we should have just ordered the fermented kelp." What followed was perhaps the most surreal diplomatic negotiation in the recorded history of interspecies relations. Amy and Brandon found themselves seated at a heavily fortified table, surrounded by enough firepower to level a small moon, attempting to explain the concept of ethical meat consumption to beings whose idea of violence was accidentally stepping on moss. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," Admiral Vashi said, her four eyes blinking in sequence as she tried to process information that clearly contradicted everything she thought she knew about the universe. "You consume other living creatures, but you do so responsibly?" "Exactly," Amy confirmed, grateful that someone was finally listening instead of building defensive structures out of tableware. Modern human society has developed comprehensive ethical standards for food production. We have regulations, inspections, humane treatment protocols. General Kraftnog lowered his weapon slightly, though his expression suggested he was still prepared for the humans to suddenly transform into ravening beasts. "You regulate your hunting?" "We don't really hunt anymore," Brandon explained patiently. "Most humans get their meat from stores, just like vegetables. It's all very civilized. There are entire industries devoted to making sure everything is done humanely and sustainably." Judge Quintara's three mouths were working independently, clearly trying to process this information through different philosophical frameworks simultaneously. "But surely you must retain the predatory instincts. The bloodthirsty urges?" Amy pulled out her personal communication device, an action that caused half the security force to raise their weapons again. "May I show you something that might help explain human nature?" After several tense minutes of weapons inspections and security protocols, Amy was permitted to display her personal photo collection on the restaurant's holographic projector. The first image showed a small, fluffy creature with large eyes and a pink tongue hanging out of its mouth. "This is my dog, Captain Biscuits," Amy announced proudly. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This was the silence of minds attempting to reboot after encountering information that simply did not compute. "Your dog," Moran whispered, his crystalline segments flickering uncertainly. "My pet," Amy clarified. "I feed him, take care of him when he's sick, play with him in the park. He sleeps on my bed and gets upset when I leave for work." Commander Tom Molly's head tilted so far that it was practically horizontal. "You keep a carnivorous creature in your dwelling? For companionship?" "He's actually omnivorous too," Brandon added helpfully. "Though he does have a weakness for bacon, and shoes, and anything that falls on the floor." The next photo showed Brandon sprawling on a couch with what appeared to be a small tiger draped across his chest, both of them looking supremely content. "And this is my cat," Professor Whiskers, Brandon announced. "She's a rescue. I found her as a kitten and nursed her back to health." Quartermaster had gone through his entire color spectrum twice and was now settling on a shade that probably meant system error in his emotional vocabulary. Let me understand, Admiral Drohorn said slowly, his tentacles moving in what might have been the galactic equivalent of a nervous tick. You apex predators keep smaller predators as friends? Family, really, Amy corrected. Humans have been domesticating animals for thousands of years. We have emotional bonds with creatures across multiple species. Dogs, cats, birds, fish, even some reptiles. But surely General Krafnog interjected, his weapon now pointed at the floor but still humming ominously. Surely you must view them as potential food sources? The look of horror that crossed both human faces was so genuine that it caused several security officers to actually step backwards. We would never eat our pets, Brandon said, his voice carrying the kind of moral outrage usually reserved for truly unthinkable crimes. That would be like eating family members. The very idea is repulsive. So you distinguish between creatures you eat and creatures you protect? Judge Quintera asked, her three mouths finally synchronizing in what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Of course, Amy replied. Just like you probably distinguish between plants you eat and plants you grow for decoration. It's about relationship, context, and emotional connection. This analogy seemed to break through the panic-induced mental barriers that had been preventing rational thought. Admiral Vashi's four eyes blinked in a pattern that suggested wheels turning in a very large and complicated mind. You mean to say, she said carefully, that your species has developed complex emotional and ethical frameworks that govern your dietary choices? Precisely, Brandon confirmed. We're not mindless killing machines. We're thinking beings with moral systems, cultural traditions, and emotional capacity for both predation and protection. The weapons finally began lowering as the assembled aliens processed this information. Morton, who had been quietly hyperventilating in the corner, suddenly perked up with renewed interest. If you have ethical frameworks, he said slowly, then you must have preferences, standards, culinary traditions that we could accommodate? And that was how the great interspecies food crisis of Station Omega-7 was finally resolved. Within hours, the emergency protocols were lifted. The improvised fortifications were dismantled, and Morden was enthusiastically researching something called fusion cuisine that would accommodate both herbivorous and omnivorous dietary requirements. The integration ceremonies proceeded without further incident, and though they now included a comprehensive cultural exchange program focusing on dietary diversity and ethical food production, Amy and Brandon became the first human ambassadors to the Peaceful Herbivore Alliance, which was promptly renamed the Peaceful Dietary Diversity Alliance. Admiral Vashi would later note in her official report that humans represented a fascinating example of evolutionary complexity, thus combining predatory capabilities with sophisticated moral reasoning and unprecedented capacity for interspecies empathy. Commander Tom Malley added that their salad-eating technique, while initially concerning, was actually quite refined. And Judge Quintera concluded that the entire incident served as a valuable reminder that first impressions, especially those based on limited dietary observations, were insufficient for understanding the true nature of any species. As for Amy and Brandon, they returned to Earth with a collection of vegetarian recipes that would revolutionize human cuisine, and a story that would be told at diplomatic gatherings for generations to come. Because nothing quite captured the absurdity of interspecies relations like the time two humans nearly started an interstellar war by asking for a steak.